Chapter 1. Departure March 1967. New York, USA. Jack Harper stood on the porch of his house, lost in thought, watching as the evening sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. His impending deployment to Indochina was inevitable. As an experienced mechanic and Marine, Jack had made this decision consciously, but the bitterness of the impending separation loomed heavily over him and his wife, Sarah. Sarah stood silently beside him, her eyes shimmering with restrained tears. 3 years of marriage had passed quickly, but their bond felt eternal. The house they had built together was their fortress, a place where they had planned to start a new chapter of their lives, have children, and enjoy simple joys. But now all that seemed distant and uncertain. "I will come back to you." Jack finally broke the silence, turning to face Sarah. He tried to find reassurance in her eyes, but instead saw only worry and hidden anxiety. She, like him, understood that the future was unknown. "You must come back," she replied softly, struggling to hold back her emotions. Her voice trembled, but she did not let go of his hand. "I will wait for you, Jack." He knew she spoke sincerely, but the fear was palpable. Jack was fully aware that he might not return. Death, like a shadow, loomed over everyone who went to war. But he couldn't allow himself to dwell on that now. Now, he needed to focus on the mission ahead. The sun had fully set, leaving behind a dark red sky. The house was quiet, as if time itself had paused, waiting for the moment when Jack would leave its walls. He knew this was their last evening together, perhaps for many months, maybe even years. They walked together to the car waiting by the road. Sarah kissed him, and that kiss was a farewell. Jack tasted her tears mixed with salt on his lips. She watched him until the car disappeared around the corner. The car that took Jack to the airport sped through the night, passing the lights of the city, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He stared out the window, watching as familiar streets gave way to dark suburbs. Ahead lay a journey into the unknown, full of dangers and trials. But deep down, he knew he would do everything possible to return to Sarah. The stars gradually appeared in the sky as the car neared the airport. Jack closed his eyes, trying to hold on to the memory of this last evening at home with Sarah by his side. These memories would be his support during the long, cold nights on the front lines when fear and uncertainty would creep into his heart. When the plane would take off, carrying him far away to Indochina, he would leave a part of his soul here. But he also knew that if he returned, this home would be waiting for him, along with Sarah. The car stopped at the terminal entrance, and Jack took a deep breath, preparing to take the first step on a journey that would change his life forever. Chapter 2. First Doubts. Several months had passed since Jack Harper left his home and deployed to serve in Indochina. Military life was harsh and unforgiving. Like many other soldiers, Jack quickly adapted to the routine: daily drills, endless missions, and the constant tension that never left him. But despite all the hardships, he remained focused and confident. After all, he had a goal: to return home to Sarah. At first, letters from Sarah arrived regularly. She wrote about her life in New York, how much she missed Jack, and how she dreamed of his safe return. These letters were a beacon of light in the darkness for him. But over time, the letters became fewer and farther between. One day, after returning from yet another mission, Jack noticed there was no letter from Sarah in the mailbag. His heart tightened with worry. He told himself that she might just be busy, but unsettling thoughts began to creep into his mind. A week passed, then another, but no letters came. Time dragged on, and Jack couldn't shake the growing anxiety. It was as if an invisible hand was squeezing his heart every time he approached the mail distribution point. And each time, his hopes were dashed against the cold reality. No letter. Then, one day, Jack finally received a letter, but it wasn't the usual comforting message from Sarah. Instead of the familiar words of love and support, he found an envelope containing photographs. In them, Sarah was pictured, but not as he knew her. She was wearing a swimsuit standing on a beach, and next to her was a man Jack didn't recognize. These photos struck him as strange. He didn't remember Sarah ever sending him pictures like these. The looks from his fellow soldiers said it all. Some exchanged glances, others smirked. Jack felt his world starting to crumble. Thoughts swirled in his mind. Why did she send these photos? Who is this man? What's happening back home? His comrades noticed the change in his behavior. Jack became withdrawn and irritable. He tried not to show how much the lack of news from Sarah was bothering him, but each day the wait for a letter became more unbearable. Questions without answers kept spinning in his head, and Jack couldn't find peace. One evening, sitting in his tent, Jack unrolled a map and tried to focus on the upcoming mission, but his thoughts kept returning to Sarah. He tried to imagine what was happening in New York, but his imagination painted disturbing images. Jack wanted to talk to someone, to share his worries, but he didn't know whom he could trust. War was no place for weakness, and his sense of uncertainty grew stronger each day. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the tropical rain pounding outside. Every sound amplified his inner turmoil. He knew the war would be tough, but he never expected his biggest battles would be fought not on the battlefield, but within his own heart. Chapter 3. Suspicions. A few weeks had passed since Jack received those strange photographs from Sarah. Each day, his anxiety grew, turning into a sharp sense of dread. The war continued, but Jack found it increasingly difficult to focus on his duties. His mind was consumed with images and suspicions that gave him no peace. One evening, after returning to camp from another patrol, Jack received a long-awaited letter. His heart raced when he recognized Sarah's handwriting on the envelope. Trying not to show his nervousness, Jack quickly opened the letter. But instead of the comforting words of love and support, he found cold and distant lines. Sarah wrote about her new friends and how she often went out with colleagues from work. Among the names mentioned, one stood out: Brian Stewart. Jack read the name several times, trying to recall if Sarah had ever mentioned Brian before. Suddenly he remembered something his parents had mentioned in one of their rare letters. They had told him that Sarah was spending a lot of time with a colleague named Brian, that she was often seen with him in local cafes and parks. Back then, Jack dismissed it as insignificant, but now it rang in his mind like an alarm bell. The letter ended with simple phrases, so unlike her previous messages. There were no words about how much she missed him or how she longed for his return. Instead, she wrote about her plans, her meetings, things that had nothing to do with their shared future. Inside Jack, a mix of anger and despair began to boil. He realized that he was starting to lose control of what was happening in his life. The suspicions he had been trying to suppress for so long now burst forth with new force. He imagined Sarah spending time with Brian and couldn't shake the feeling that she had betrayed him. The next day, Jack decided to talk to one of his comrades, Tom, with whom he had formed a close friendship. Tom was older and seemed to have more life experience. Jack hoped that Tom could help him make sense of the situation. "Tom, have you ever doubted what's happening back home?" Jack asked one evening as they sat by the fire after a long day. Tom looked at him with interest. He understood that Jack wasn't asking this question lightly. "There have been moments," Tom replied after a pause, "but in those moments I tried to keep a cool head. War is no place for those thoughts. They can kill you faster than the enemy." Jack nodded, but his doubts remained. He knew Tom was right, but he couldn't just brush aside his feelings. His love for Sarah was too strong, and the thought that she might betray him was unbearable. In the following days, Jack tried to regain his focus, immersing himself in his duties. But each new letter from Sarah only heightened his anxiety. They became more and more detached, and he felt a growing distance between them, a distance he didn't know how to bridge. One evening, as Jack once again lay in his bed unable to sleep, his thoughts returned to Sarah and Brian. He realized that he could no longer ignore his suspicions. They were becoming too real to simply dismiss. Jack made a decision. He had to find out the truth no matter what it was. This decision brought him a strange sense of relief. Now he had a purpose to uncover what was happening. But with that also came the realization that his life, as he knew it, might change forever. Chapter 4. Wounded and Returning Home. January 1968 became one of the bloodiest months of the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive caught American soldiers off guard, and Jack Harper found himself in the thick of it. The battles were fierce, and every day brought new losses. Jack fought with desperate determination, but deep inside, he was still tormented by thoughts of Sarah and her possible infidelity. However, there was no time for reflection on the battlefield. During one of the operations, their unit was ambushed. Explosions tore through the air, the ground shook, and Jack watched as his comrades fell one by one. Trying to take cover behind a crumbling wall, he suddenly felt a sharp impact in his chest and collapsed to the ground. The pain was intense, searing, but even in that moment his thoughts turned to Sarah. He lost consciousness, hearing the last sounds of the battle raging somewhere in the distance. Jack woke up in a hospital surrounded by pain on all sides. The first thing he saw was the white ceiling tiles and the slowly spinning fans. It took him a few seconds to understand where he was. A nurse stood nearby, explaining that he had been wounded and evacuated to San Francisco for treatment. In the first few days, his condition had been critical, but now he was on the road to recovery. At first, Jack was relieved to have survived, but then thoughts of Sarah filled his mind once more. He realized that now he would have the chance to return home and uncover the truth. Memories of Sarah's last letters and the photographs he had received resurfaced, and Jack felt his anxiety grow. After a few weeks of treatment, the doctors informed Jack that he was well enough to return home. He felt that his body was beginning to heal, but the emotional wounds remained open. Thoughts of Sarah, Brian, and the possibility of betrayal tore at him from the inside. Jack didn't know what to expect when he returned to New York, but he knew he had to face it head on. When the plane landed in New York, Jack felt the cold air of his hometown for the first time in months. His parents met him at the airport with smiles on their faces, but in their eyes he saw something more: concern and hidden worry. They hugged him, but Jack noticed that they were avoiding talking about Sarah. On the drive home in the car, his father finally spoke, avoiding eye contact with his son. "Jack, we need to tell you something," he began, carefully choosing his words. "Sarah, she hasn't been in touch for a long time. We tried to talk to her, but she's practically disappeared. She took almost all the money from your joint accounts, and the house is in disrepair." His father's words hit Jack harder than any bullet. He sat silently as his mother explained that neighbors had seen Sarah with Brian, that she no longer lived in their home, and that no one knew where she was now. Each new revelation felt like a dagger to his soul, shattering any remaining illusions and hopes. When they finally pulled up to the house, Jack felt his legs tremble. The house, which he had once considered his fortress, now looked grim and abandoned. The overgrown yard and peeling paint on the walls told him that his absence had taken its toll. Jack entered the house, and a sense of emptiness overwhelmed him. Things were scattered everywhere. Furniture was covered in dust, and an old calendar on the kitchen wall showed dates from months ago, as if time had stopped the day Sarah left. He didn't know how long he stood there in that dead house before he realized he needed to act. Jack decided that the first thing he had to do was find out everything that had happened during his absence. He couldn't leave it in the past without understanding it, and he couldn't move forward until he knew the truth. Inside, rage mixed with pain began to boil, but along with it came determination. He had to find Sarah, learn what had happened, and put an end to this chapter of his life. Chapter 5. Secrets and Lies. Jack knew that to uncover the truth he would need help. He couldn't do it alone, especially in his current physical and emotional state. The first step was to hire a private investigator. An old childhood friend recommended Mark Reynolds, a seasoned and perceptive specialist known for his ability to solve the most complex cases. Mark's office was located in an old brick building on the outskirts of the city. Jack arrived there at dawn when the city was still asleep, and with some trepidation, climbed the creaky stairs. He wasn't sure how this conversation would begin, but he knew Mark was his best chance to get to the bottom of things. "Harper, it's been a while," Mark greeted him, shaking his hand. There was professional caution in his eyes, but also a willingness to help. "I need your help, Mark," Jack said directly, sitting down in the offered chair. He told Mark everything about the strange letters, Sarah's disappearance, and her alleged relationship with Brian Stewart. When he finished, a tense silence hung in the room. Mark listened carefully and nodded, opening his notebook. "I'll take the case, Jack, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that we'll uncover more than just what you suspect. Sometimes the truth can be much darker than it seems." In the following days, Mark began his investigation. Jack tried not to interfere, knowing that the detective needed time to gather information. However, his anxiety did not diminish. Every day without news only heightened his worry. A week later, Mark called Jack and suggested they meet at his office. The seriousness in the detective's voice only intensified the tension Jack felt in his chest. He arrived at Mark's office expecting to hear something significant. "I found something you may not like," Mark said as soon as Jack walked in. He handed him several photographs and documents. The photographs showed Sarah with Brian, but these were not just friendly meetings. The images, taken in various locations around the city, showed them together in intimate embraces, sharing romantic dinners. It was the betrayal that Jack had long tried to deny. But that wasn't all. Mark showed him documents he had uncovered. It turned out that Sarah and Brian were involved in financial fraud related to their work. They had used the money withdrawn from the joint accounts to fund their illegal activities. The house that Jack and Sarah had once considered their fortress had been mortgaged, and its future was now hanging by a thread. "They didn't just cheat on you, Jack," Mark said, looking intently at his friend. "They used you, your trust, and your resources to live a double life. And from what I can tell, they're planning something even bigger." These revelations hit Jack like a lightning bolt. He felt the ground slipping away beneath his feet. Everything he had known about Sarah had crumbled. The woman he had loved and trusted more than anyone had become entangled in criminal activities. Jack couldn't believe that the person with whom he had shared his life had turned out to be so different. "What should I do now?" Jack asked quietly, his eyes still on the photographs. "We need to act quickly," Mark replied. "I'll continue the investigation, but you need to contact a lawyer and start protecting your interests. They've already caused you a lot of harm, but you can still save what's left." Jack knew Mark was right. His life had changed forever, but now he had a clear goal: to sever all ties with Sarah, protect what was left of his past, and start building a new life. However, he also understood that many dark and painful revelations still lay ahead. Chapter 6. Rescue. Several days had passed since Jack learned the truth about Sarah and Brian. Despite the shock and bitterness, he began to take action, following Mark's advice. First, he contacted a military lawyer to prepare the paperwork for the divorce and to protect his assets. It was a painful but necessary step. Jack felt that with every document he signed, he was breaking away from the past and moving closer to a new beginning. One evening, after a long and stressful day, Jack decided to take a walk around the city to clear his mind. Contrary to his expectations, the streets of New York, which had once seemed familiar and comforting, now only evoked a sense of loneliness and detachment. As he passed by a deserted alley, he suddenly heard a woman's cries for help. Without a second thought, he ran toward the sound. In the alley, he saw a young woman surrounded by 3 aggressive men. They were threatening her, and it was clear that she was in grave danger. Jack, without hesitation, intervened. He quickly assessed the situation and, using the skills he had acquired in the war, launched himself at one of the attackers. Caught off guard, the men hesitated, and a fight broke out. Despite his recent injury, Jack managed to fend off the attackers and protect the woman. Startled by his decisive resistance, the assailants retreated and fled, leaving Jack and the woman alone in the dark alley. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, helping the woman to her feet. She was shaken and frightened, but gratitude shone in her eyes. "Yes, thank you. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't come," she replied, still trembling from the ordeal. Jack carefully examined her to make sure she wasn't injured. The woman was young, with long chestnut hair and bright green eyes. She was clearly in shock, but she tried to stay composed. "My name is Jack. I'm glad I was here in time," he said, extending his hand. "Amelia," she introduced herself with a slight smile. "Thank you, Jack. I owe you my life." They left the alley together and made their way to a more populated street. Amelia told Jack that she worked at a local cafe and was on her way home when the men suddenly surrounded her. She was sure she wouldn't see another day, but Jack had become her savior. Amelia offered to take Jack to the cafe where she worked to thank him with a cup of coffee. Jack, despite feeling tired, agreed. He wanted to spend some time in good company, even if just to momentarily forget his heavy thoughts. In the cozy, warm cafe, they sat at a table by the window. Amelia made them both a cup of strong coffee and sat down across from Jack. They started a conversation that soon turned into a deep and trusting exchange. Jack felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Amelia was sincere and empathetic, and her presence helped him distance himself from the pain of the past few days. Amelia listened attentively as Jack shared his story. He told her about Sarah, about the war, about how everything in his life had taken a turn for the worse. Amelia, in turn, shared how she had come to New York in search of a better life, but had faced her own challenges and disappointments. Their conversations lasted late into the night, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt less alone. When it was time to say goodbye, Amelia offered Jack her support. She understood what he was going through and was ready to be there for him if he needed it. Jack was touched by her kindness and suggested they meet again. They parted ways outside the cafe, and as Jack walked home, he felt some of the heaviness in his heart lift. Amelia had become a beacon of light in the darkness he was experiencing. Perhaps this was the beginning of his slow but steady journey toward a new life, where the past would finally cease to cast its shadow over him. Chapter 7. Preparing for Divorce. The days following Jack's encounter with Amelia brought some relief. Her support helped him cope with the heavy thoughts and emotions that had weighed him down since his return home. However, Jack understood that despite the new person in his life, he needed to close the chapter on his past. The military lawyer Jack had hired turned out to be experienced and reliable. His name was Richard Benson, and he immediately took the case with full seriousness. Jack felt more at ease knowing he had professional help. They began gathering all the necessary documents, including the evidence collected by Mark, to use in court. "You need to be prepared for anything, Jack," Richard said as he reviewed the documents. "Sarah and Brian might try every trick in the book to squeeze as much as they can out of you, but with what we've got, we have a strong chance of winning this case." Every day spent preparing for the court battle was emotionally exhausting for Jack. He constantly found himself thinking back to the days when his marriage to Sarah seemed strong and secure. But now, with the truth out in the open, Jack realized how much he had overlooked or chosen to ignore. At one of the meetings with Richard, Jack received some disturbing news. Sarah and Brian had decided not to go down without a fight. They filed a countersuit claiming that Jack, while on duty, had supposedly been unfaithful and irresponsible with their finances, which they alleged led to all their problems. These accusations were false, but they showed how far Sarah and Brian were willing to go to protect themselves. This news infuriated Jack. He felt his patience wearing thin. How could they so easily twist everything and make him the villain in something he hadn't done? Richard, seeing this, reassured him, reminding him that their main task was to keep a cool head and gather the evidence that would expose all the false accusations. "They're hoping you'll lose control, Jack," Richard said. "But if you stay composed, we can bring them down. We have enough material to prove their guilt." Despite the lawyer's advice, Jack couldn't shake the growing sense of injustice. The memories of Sarah and how much he had trusted her now felt like painful stabs. But every time he felt himself starting to lose control, he remembered Amelia's words, which had supported him through these difficult days. Amelia had become his refuge. They started seeing each other more often, and every time they met, she was attentive and caring, helping Jack maintain his inner balance. She talked to him about her day, listened to his thoughts, and gradually Jack began to feel that with each conversation, he was slowly returning to life. One evening, as they sat in the cafe, Jack, deep in thought, shared his decision to sell the house. "That house isn't mine anymore," he said, turning the cup of coffee in his hands. "It was our place, mine and Sarah's, but now I can't live there. Too many memories, too much pain." Amelia listened carefully, not interrupting. She understood that this was an important step for Jack and respected his decision. "I think you're right," she said softly. "Sometimes, to move forward, you need to let go of the past. And that house is part of the past you need to leave behind." Jack nodded, feeling that this was the right decision. However, despite all the changes, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah and Brian might try to interfere in his life once again. This fear lingered even after the court case was settled, and these fears turned out to be justified. A few days after the house was put on the market, Jack received a troubling message from Mark. The detective informed him that Sarah and Brian were actively looking for ways to harm Jack, using connections and illegal methods. They couldn't accept that they had lost, and now they were willing to do anything to get revenge. This news deeply unsettled Jack. He knew he couldn't let his guard down now. He contacted Richard and Mark to discuss possible precautions. They agreed to stay vigilant and report any suspicious activity immediately. Jack felt the tension rising within him once more. He wanted to move on, forget the past, but he realized that Sarah and Brian might not leave him in peace. At that moment, he understood that his fight was not over yet. But now he had support that helped him keep his composure. Amelia also sensed that Jack was becoming more withdrawn and anxious again. She tried to help him relax, but she could see how the old wounds were reopening. One evening, as they were having dinner at her place, she gently brought up the subject. "Jack, I can see that you're worried again," she began, holding his hand. "I'm here for you. But you need to know that you're not alone anymore. We'll get through this together." Her words brought Jack some comfort. He knew he could rely on Amelia, but he also realized that this battle was one he had to fight himself. "I just want all of this to be over," he said quietly. "I'm tired of Sarah and Brian continuing to affect my life, even when everything should have ended by now." "You're stronger than you think, Jack," Amelia replied. "You've already been through so much, and I believe you can handle this too." With these words, Jack felt that he needed to take another step. He decided to finally cut all remaining ties that connected him to Sarah. He reached out to Mark, asking him to keep monitoring the situation, but also expressed his intention to fully focus on the future. With each new meeting with Amelia, Jack felt more and more that the past was losing its hold on him. He knew that the struggle wasn't over yet, but now he was confident that he could win it. Every day, his belief that he was on the right path grew stronger. Chapter 8. The Court Hearing. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Jack Harper could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been preparing for over the past few months, yet he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into the unknown. He put on his Marine dress uniform, a symbol of his dedication and honor, which had become an integral part of who he was. This uniform was meant to remind him of who he was and what he had endured. The court hearing took place in a large room with high ceilings and a stern atmosphere. Jack entered the room accompanied by Richard Benson, who immediately took his place at the attorney's table. On the opposite side of the room, Jack saw Sarah and Brian. They sat together, their faces cold and distant. In that moment, Jack felt that everything he had once felt for Sarah had now become a painful memory. The judge, an elderly man with deep wrinkles on his face, began the proceedings. He looked carefully at each person present, making it clear that this day would be long and challenging. A tense silence settled over the room, broken only by the footsteps of the court bailiff. Richard began his opening statement confidently, presenting evidence of Sarah's infidelity and her involvement in financial fraud. He submitted the photographs taken by Mark and the documents that confirmed Sarah and Brian's illegal activities. Every word Richard spoke was like a nail in the coffin of their defense. When it was the turn of Sarah's attorney, he attempted to shift the blame onto Jack, accusing him of allegedly abandoning his wife and claiming that this was what drove her to cheat. However, the judge was steadfast. He understood that Jack had been fulfilling his duty to his country and that this could not be used as an excuse for her actions. Each time Sarah's attorney tried to portray her in a more favorable light, Richard skillfully refuted these claims by returning to the facts. Jack sat quietly, trying to remain calm, although inside him everything was boiling. He couldn't believe that Sarah and Brian could go to such lengths in their attempts to justify themselves. When it was time for Jack to speak, he stood up and faced the court. There was determination in his eyes, and his voice was firm despite the inner turmoil. He told his story, not hiding the pain and disappointment he had gone through. He spoke about his loyalty, about how he had thought of Sarah every day while on the front lines, and how his world collapsed when he learned the truth. "I believed in our marriage, believed that we were a team," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "But I never imagined that the woman I loved would be involved in betrayal and deceit." Sarah averted her gaze, unable to meet his eyes, but Brian maintained an icy expression. The judge listened attentively, not interrupting Jack. When Jack finished speaking, he sat back down, feeling a bit more at peace. He had said everything he needed to say, and now all that was left was to wait. After several hours of tense deliberation, the judge finally delivered his verdict. His voice was loud and clear in the silence of the courtroom. He found Jack not guilty of any of the accusations made against him and ruled that Sarah and Brian were to pay compensation for the damage they had caused. The court also awarded Jack ownership of the house, dismissing all of Sarah's claims to the property. When the judge concluded his ruling, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had won this battle. Sarah and Brian stood up and quickly left the room without saying a word. At that moment, Jack realized that this was the end of their story. He no longer felt anger or resentment, only deep disappointment and exhaustion. Richard congratulated him on the victory, shaking his hand. Jack thanked him, realizing that his life was finally free from the chains of the past. But more than anyone, he was grateful to Amelia, who was waiting for him outside the courtroom. She had been the one to support him through this difficult journey. As they stepped out into the street, the cold New York air refreshed his thoughts. Jack looked at Amelia and, for the first time in a long while, felt that something good was finally on the horizon. The court case was behind him, and now he could move forward, building a new life free from lies and betrayal. Chapter 9. The break after the court hearing, Jack Harper's life finally began to return to normal. The house he had once shared with Sarah was now officially his again. However, despite this, every corner of that place reminded him of what had happened. He realized that he could no longer live there, not with the constant memories of how everything had fallen apart. Jack decided that the best way to move forward was to start fresh. He made the decision to sell the house and use the money to begin a new life somewhere else. This house had once symbolized their shared dreams, but now it was a symbol of shattered illusions. With Richard's help, he quickly arranged the paperwork, and the house was put on the market. In the meantime, Jack continued to see Amelia. Their relationship deepened. She had become his loyal companion, always ready to listen and support him through the difficult moments. Their friendship gradually blossomed into something more, though both of them were cautious, taking things slowly. Jack was still healing from his physical and emotional wounds, and Amelia understood that. One evening, as they were walking together in Central Park, Jack shared his decision to sell the house. "That house isn't mine anymore," he said, looking out over the park. "It was our place. mine and Sarah's. But now I can't live there. There are too many memories, too much pain. Amelia listened carefully, not interrupting. She understood that this was an important step for Jack, and she respected his decision. I think you're right, she said softly. Sometimes, to move forward, you have to let go of the past. And that house is part of the past that you need to leave behind. Jack nodded, feeling that this decision was the right one. However, despite all the changes, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah and Brian might try to interfere in his life once more. This fear lingered, even after the court case was over. And his fears turned out to be justified. A few days after the house was listed for sale, Jack received a troubling message from Mark. The detective informed him that Sarah and Brian were actively seeking ways to harm Jack, using their connections and illegal methods. They couldn't accept that they had lost and were now willing to do anything to get revenge. This news deeply unsettled Jack. He realized that he couldn't afford to relax just yet. He contacted Richard and Mark to discuss possible precautions. They agreed to stay vigilant and report any suspicious activity immediately. Jack felt the tension rising within him once more. He wanted to move forward and forget the past, but he realized that Sarah and Brian might not leave him in peace. At that moment, he understood that his battle wasn't over yet. But now, he had support that helped him maintain his composure. Amelia also sensed that Jack was becoming more withdrawn and anxious again. She tried to help him relax, but she could see how the old wounds were reopening. One evening, as they were having dinner at her place, she gently broached the subject. "Jack, I can see that you're worried again," she began, holding his hand. "I'm here for you, but you need to know that you're not alone anymore. We'll get through this together." Her words brought Jack some comfort. He knew he could rely on Amelia, but he also realized that this was a battle he had to fight on his own. "I just want all of this to be over," he said quietly. "I'm tired of Sarah and Brian continuing to affect my life, even when everything should have ended by now." "You're stronger than you think, Jack," Amelia replied. "You've already been through so much, and I believe you can handle this too." With these words, Jack felt that he needed to take another step. He decided to finally cut all remaining ties that connected him to Sarah. He reached out to Mark, asking him to continue monitoring the situation, but he also expressed his intention to fully focus on the future. With each new meeting with Amelia, Jack felt more and more that the past was losing its hold on him. He knew that the struggle wasn't over yet, but now he was confident that he could win it. Every day, his belief that he was on the right path grew stronger. Chapter 10. A new start. Several weeks had passed since Jack made the decision to finally sever all ties with the past. The house was sold, and he felt that he had finally freed himself from the heavy burden that had weighed on him for the past months. He decided to invest the money in a new business, a small auto repair shop, something he had long dreamed of. Jack had always loved working with cars, and this seemed like the perfect way to start a new chapter in his life. Amelia supported him in this new venture. Together they found a suitable location for the shop on the outskirts of the city, near a busy street where there was always plenty of traffic. Jack threw himself into the work with enthusiasm, putting all his energy and skills into creating a place that could become his new fortress. With each passing day, Jack felt his life slowly returning to normal. Working on cars brought him a sense of peace and satisfaction that he hadn't felt in a long time. He enjoyed the fact that he was once again in control of his destiny, building something with his own hands. Amelia often came to the shop, bringing lunch and helping with small tasks. Their relationship continued to grow closer, and Jack realized that he had found in her not just a friend, but someone with whom he wanted to share his future. One evening, as they sat together in the empty garage, enjoying the quiet after a long day of work, Jack suddenly realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt truly happy. He looked at Amelia, and a warm feeling filled his heart. "Amelia," he began, taking her hand. "You know, I've been through a lot, and you've been with me through the hardest moments. I want you to know that I've never been as sure of anything as I am of wanting to spend my life with you." Amelia smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and joy. "Jack, I'll always be with you. I've seen you fight, and I've seen you recover. I believe that only good things lie ahead for us now." They sat together, holding hands, feeling that their future was finally beginning to take shape, bright and clear. In that moment, Jack realized that all the trials he had gone through had led him to this point, to a new beginning with Amelia. Despite all the obstacles, Jack had not only survived but had also managed to build a new life, free from the shadows of the past. Now he had a new goal, a new home, and a new love. The auto repair shop he opened was starting to bring in profit, and customers were returning for the quality service he provided. Jack knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but now he was confident that he could handle any challenge. One day, as they were closing up the garage after a long day, Amelia stopped and looked at him with a smile. "You know, Jack, I think we've finally found our home," she said, gazing at the cozy little garage they had turned into a successful business. Jack smiled back, feeling warmth in his chest. "Yes, Amelia, and I'm glad I found it with you." They turned off the lights and stepped out onto the street, where a gentle evening breeze brushed against their faces. Jack knew that there were many good days ahead of them, and he finally felt